Now, Kofi Annan died on Saturday at the age of 80 years after serving for a long period at the UN. And of course, he has been termed as a man who ensured that peace remains, especially in Africa. And of course, he also fought for the human rights. And of course, in 2007, remember when Kenya was underwent the 2007-2008 post-election violence, Kofi Annan was the man behind the peace that Kenya enjoyed during that period. And this morning, I'd like us to have that conversation with the Executive Director of Global Peace Foundation, that is none other than Daniel Juma, just to try and understand that good and the challenging times that Kofi Annan had before his demise on Saturday. Daniel, first things first. We are talking about Kofi Annan. As a person, you work at the Global Peace Foundation, which is almost in synchrony with what Kofi Annan did while he was still alive. What would you have to say about him?
Thank you, Brenda, and welcome to News Center.
Thank you.
I'm glad to be with you on your first show. The world mourns a great person, an icon. For anyone who is talking about diplomacy, international relations, you have to study about Kofi Annan. He gave us an opportunity to believe in multilateralism. You can never talk about global peace, world peace, without looking at the work Kofi Annan did. He joined the UN in 1962, and he rose through the ranks. Actually, the first, African to be, appointed Secretary General, serving from 1997 to 2006. The work that he has done, before he joined the UN, was basically known as, basically lackluster in addressing global issues. But when Kofi Annan came in, look at the things he did. He reformed the United Nations. He was responsible, for launching the Millennium Development Goals, which today is known as the SDGs. Kofi Annan also is credited with the International Criminal Court, which, as you know, has been, effective in looking at issues of international crimes against humanity. And the most important thing that we'll remember him with is, putting, the principle of responsibility to protect at the center of international action. So whenever the United Nations intervened, call it Kosovo, Iraq, the guiding principles was that the United Nations had a responsibility to protect the people. Yes.
Okay. And just before we continue with this conversation when it comes to the late Kofi Annan, let's just have a look at a story that was prepared by my colleague Duncan Haimbe, just to remember the good times of the late Annan.
Mention the name Kofi Annan and what comes to the minds of Kenyans and the African continent is this historic picture outside Harambee House stairs. It was on February 28, 2008, when the soft-spoken Ghanaian announced to the country and the world that there was a political deal.
As I announced earlier today, we do have a deal.
This was the culmination of a politically painful and rigorous power-sharing negotiations between then-President Mwai Kibaki's PNU wing and Raila Odinga's ODM party, following a disputed presidential election in which both parties claimed victory, a standoff that had resulted in a political turmoil that saw hundreds of Kenyans die and thousands displaced in the ensuing post-election violence. It was the African Union's panel of African eminent persons led by Kofi Annan that brokered a power-sharing deal between Kibaki and Raila Odinga in talks that were held at the Serena Hotel that saw the formation of the Grand Coalition government.
The real challenge now is for President Kibaki and Honorable Raila Odinga to work together to heal and reconcile this nation, working jointly to implement the reform agenda on which they have agreed, and sustaining the effort until the job is done.
10 years later, and the world's top diplomat is no more. Kofi Atta Annan, who once served as the 7th United Nations Secretary General from January 1997 to December 2006, died early Saturday after a short illness. Former President Daniel Arap Moi described Annan as a public servant who was committed to peace and harmony for all mankind. He added that his commitment to resolution of conflict through dialogue will be his biggest legacy. On his part, President Uhuru Kenyatta said in a statement, and I quote, "In this moment of sorrow, I condole with his family, relatives and friends. My thoughts and prayers out to them as they come to terms with this sad news." In his statement, ODM party leader Raila Odinga said, "In Kenya, we retain fond memories of Dr. Annan as the man who stepped in and saved the country from collapse following the 2007-2008 post-election violence." In a statement announcing his death, the Kofi Annan Foundation described him as a global statesman and deeply committed internationalist who fought throughout his life for a fairer and more peaceful world. It is here at the Serena Hotel, Nairobi, where the world's top diplomat, soft-spoken Kofi Annan, for over a month, he led tough political negotiations whose culmination was the signing of that famous National Accord for Kenya. Duncan Hemba, KTN News, Nairobi.
Thank you so much, Duncan Haemba, for just taking us through the life, the good times of Kofi Annan, especially when he was in Kenya in 2007, 2008. And it is a discussion that we're having this morning with the Executive Director of Global Peace Foundation, that is Daniel Juma. And of course, before we took a break just to get to watch what Duncan Haemba had prepared for us, we were talking about the good times of Kofi Annan at the UN, and of course the kind of changes that he brought. Yeah. But at the same time, despite the fact that we are celebrating his good times, Kofi Annan also faced a lot of criticism. And I'd like to ask our producer just to put that on the super wall. And there were several, of course. We had the Rwanda genocide, where Kofi Annan was being accused of not, doing much to prevent that genocide from happening. People are saying he should have even requested for more troops to be taken there. Yeah. And what do you have to say about that?
Yes, of course, in this life, you can never succeed in anything without criticisms. The Rwanda genocide, indeed, everyone accepts, it was a failure on the part of the UN. But of course, it's the bureaucracy within the UN. At that time, Kofi Annan wasn't a Secretary General, but of course, he was in a position to be able to influence, whatever course the UN would have taken. But that was a lesson, a very, very important lesson, that the UN and the international community learned, because we lost, so many lives in Rwanda before they decided to take action. So that is one of the, the failures. But then I think as soon as he came in as Secretary General, having learned from that failure, Kofi Annan, made sure that the UN was actually taking its responsibility to protect very, very seriously. As you know, in international relations, the concept of sovereignty, is something that has always been, sometimes controversial, vis-a-vis responsibility to protect.
So are you trying, Daniel, are you trying to say that Kofi Annan shouldn't take the blame fully for what happened in Rwanda?
I don't want to attribute the blame to the person of Kofi Annan, because when you're working for a system, you know, and at the moment, at that time, he wasn't at the top of the United Nations, you know. So when you're working for a system, you know, there is a bureaucracy. So, you know, instead of just giving the blame to him, you attribute it to the United Nations as a whole at that time, at that particular time, yes.
And why do you think people have, the people who've chosen to look at his failures, especially people are mentioning Rwanda, Bosnia, but we'll be getting to Bosnia later on. But Rwanda seems to have taken the center stage during this time when people are mourning the late Kofi Annan.
Because that was a blot in the history of international relations. Whatever happened in Rwanda should never have been allowed to go on. You know, world powers at that time, you know, should have intervened to ensure that the lives that were lost in Rwanda were not lost. It was not necessary, you know, to lose lives because of a political dispute. And that's why, you know, when he came to Kenya, you know, after post-election violence, the work that he did, you know, bringing the two camps together, even though after that time more than 1,000 lives had been lost. And we realized when he was talking to former President Kibaki and Raila Odinga, one of the reasons that he told them to make a deal was telling them, Mr. President, more than 1,000 lives have been lost. You have to make a deal.
So he didn't want like Kenya to go the Rwanda way?
Yes, he didn't want Kenya to go the Rwanda way. That was a nightmare.
Okay.
You know? Yes.
Then let's cross over to Bosnia. In 1995,
yes.
Kofi Annan also failed to stop the mass slaughter of over 8,000 boys and men. And in both instances, the United Nations peacekeepers were on the ground under his command. Same thing, different, it's just the same script but different places. It happened in Rwanda, now again in Bosnia.
Yes, just as I said, you know, at that time he wasn't at the apex of the United Nations, and as you know, at that particular time, even before then, you must realize that you know, the world powers, you know, had veto powers on what happens within the United Nations. For example, I remember the then Secretary General Boutros Ghali, you know, had problems with the United States, you know, Madeleine Albright, always disagreeing on issues on Iraq, you know, interventions and stuff. Say that, of course, the failures were there. He was at the ground. But then if you look at the bureaucracy within the UN, you know, the UN basically is there at the behest of the states, the powerful states. You know, the US, the EU, all those that hold veto powers gets to decide what action is taken at the end of the day.
What action is taken at the end of the day. Yes. Now, the latest, the major scandal that Kofi Annan faced while he was at the helm of the UN was the corruption scandal that involved his son. And really, it made his integrity to be questioned and involvement of his family. That is, I'm talking about the Iraqi oil for food scandal in the 1990s.
Yes, of course, you know, that's something that involved his son. But then as a person, the integrity of Kofi Annan has never been in question. But that is a lesson to everyone, you know, leaders, world leaders all over. As you know, whenever you're a leader, you know, people, your family always tend, you know, to think that you can, you know, give them favors, that you can be able to accord them favors because of the fact that you are linked with them. That was a blot on his history, on his character. But I think that overall, you know, the achievements of Kofi Annan in the international stage were able, you know, to cloud even those negativities and those failures that he may have suffered as a result of that.
Okay. Kofi Annan is from Ghana. He's an African, of course. Yes. And as we celebrate his life, you know, there's so many concerns from Africans, especially Kenyans, that as much as you're celebrating his life, leaders say, let's celebrate his life, let's maintain his legacy. It is just a speech. But one question is, how practical can we, you know, celebrate the legacy that Kofi Annan has left behind?
I think we must acknowledge, apart from Boutros Ghali, who was the first UN Secretary General, who was basically from Egypt, this was the first, you know, African, you know, to rise to this, and that in itself was not a simple, you know, achievement, you know. But of course, as you know, the reason why he was appointed was to assuage Africa because at that time, the U.S. refused to back Boutros Ghali's, for a second term because of the disagreements in Iraq and all the other countries. And then Kofi Annan came in basically to assuage Africans. That appointment came in. But as you know, the work that he tried to achieve, in Africa, the issues of election-related violence, especially Kenya, stood out.
Yeah.
As you know, if he did not succeed in Kenya in 2007, 2008, that would have been a blot, not just on his, on himself as an African, but the whole of African continent would have really, had bad legacy. And that's why I think we must agree that Annan, and if you read his books, 2 books, We the People, and then the other one, Intervention, it shows you, how he tried, mediation, in Kosovo, in East Timor. The man was always seated, at some point he was seated in front of the Taliban, negotiating, trying to be able to intervene. He was a brave man who was, really, looking for a better world, in a situation whereby violence was the role of the day.
Okay, and just before we bring this discussion closer home in terms of the role that Kofi Annan played, and just before we get to read one of the condolence messages that Honorable Raila Odinga sent to Kofi Annan's family, it is that during 2007, 2008, when we experienced the post-election violence, before you answer my question, and we'll have the clip later on, it is that the African Union appointed eminent persons to spearhead these negotiations between former President Mwai Kibaki and Honorable Raila Odinga. It is that the team had Kofi Annan, it had Jakaya Kikwete, and it had Nkapa, and everyone's eye was just on Kofi Annan. Why this man, Kofi Annan? That is a question I want you to answer later on. But first, I'd like us to have a clip of what ODM leader Raila Odinga had to say following the demise of Kofi Annan, who died on Saturday at the age of 80. Let's have a look at that clip.
Baadaye tukasema Kenya ni muhimu zaidi kulinda kila mtu. Kibaki yuko pale, mimi niko hapa. Tumeongea mpaka baadaye yale ambayo ilishinda wale ambao walikuwa wanang'ang'ana kule Serena Hotel. Tukakubaliana mimi na Kibaki. Na baadaye tukakubaliana kuweka hiyo sahihi. Na tukatoka nje mpaka tukasema sasa moshi nyeupe ndio hiyo. Kwa hivyo mimi ningependa kwa heshima ya Kofi Annan ambaye alituaga jana, tusimame kwa dakika moja.
All right, those are the sentiments of ODM leader Raila Odinga, his message of condolence to the family of the late Kofi Annan, who died on Saturday.